our opening plenary this evening in South Africa. But to everyone around the world, be it morning or afternoon or evening, we'd like to welcome you today. Hope that I'm loud and clear. Perhaps you can indicate in the chat that you can hear me clearly. But I think we'll just be starting in a minute or two. We are very excited to see the list of attendees and the number of attendees steadily climbing. But we really will get started in about a minute, where I will introduce myself and hand over to the moderator for this evening, who is Tshepo Putu, who will then guide us through the presentation today. So in literally about 1 minute, we will kick off the webinar. All right, so I think we are ready to kick off, and I will start with today's proceedings. So my name is Bandile Ngidi. I'm the project coordinator for the Rethinking Economics project at the Institute for Economic Justice. I am one of the organizers of our annual Rethinking Economics for Africa Festival, and I'll mention all the organizations in a moment. This festival is in its third iteration, and we're very excited to bring it to you. COVID-19, however, has really changed the world, as we've seen in 2020, and this is the first time we're hosting it online. But we really believe that today's discussion will unpack some of the new opportunities and threats that this COVID-19 moment has presented, not including or not forgetting the fact that this convening, which is usually a physical convening in Johannesburg, South Africa, is now being hosted online. As we continue, I'd like to give a special thanks to the partner organizations that have really helped in this year's festival. They include the Institute for Economic Justice, the student groups of Rethinking Economics for Africa, and the Saatchi Chair from the University, the Saatchi Chair in Industrial Development at the University of Johannesburg. These partner organizations have played a critical role in this year, but we also thank other organizations that have supported REFA in the past, and we are excited that we're able to continue the great legacy of this event. A very special shout out or thank you that we'd like to give is to the Frederick Ebert Stichting South Africa office, that has been the main sponsor of the festival over the last 3 years. We're very, very grateful to the help of the South Africa office and the continual support that they give us. And on this year's festival, to ensure that as many people as possible could attend online, given the data challenges, we're thankful to a number of donor contributors, including the Open University Department of Economics. So the last from me is just a note on how you can participate in this webinar, and then I'll hand over to our moderator, Tseho. Mainly, if you've got a question, you can use the Q&A function below at the bottom of your screen, and we'd encourage you to upvote the other questions that appear on this Q&A function, so we can get to the popular ones. And you can also tweet with us on the hashtag REFA 2020. So thank you very much from me, and I'll hand over to Tseho.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. My name is Tseho Putu. I'm a master's student at the University of Cape Town, studying development economics. And I'm recently a Carter Asmal Fellow at Trinity College in Dublin. I'm very excited to moderate this discussion today. The topic is, what does the COVID-19 moment mean for economics teaching and research in the Global South? And we've spent many months sourcing out these amazing speakers that we have today, so we can have their knowledge and their wisdom, have access to their knowledge and their wisdom, but also to guide us into the discussions that we're going to be having this weekend. So I'm very excited to introduce our three speakers for today. We have, going first, so I'm going to introduce them and then we will move on. We have Professor Jayati Ghosh, who is an economics professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, India. Her research is centered on globalization, international trade and finance, macroeconomic policy, and issues related to gender and development. She works very closely with progressive organizations and social movements and has consulted for large international organizations. And then we're going to have second Fatimah Kelleher, who's a women's rights strategic and technical advisor for feminist research policy and advocacy across Africa. She also has experience working in South Asia and the Caribbean. And she's also worked with women's groups, civil society, government bodies, international NGOs, and has a wealth of knowledge and experience in this sector and knows a lot about how it works. And then lastly, we're going to have Professor Leonce Ndikumana, who is a distinguished professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts. He has served as the director of research at the African Development Bank and has worked at organizations like the United Nations Economics Commission for Africa. His research interests deal with issues of external debt, capital flight, financial markets, growth, and the economics of conflict and war in Africa. So we're going to have each speaker speak for about 10 to 15 minutes each. And then we're going to have a Q&A session afterwards that's going to run for about half an hour. So I think it was Professor Jayati. Please, could you take the floor? You are very welcome. We're excited to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Sego. And it's such a pleasure to be with all of you again. I remember attending the REFA Festival last year in Johannesburg, and I was really struck by the liveliness of the discussions, the sense of excitement, and the fact that there were so many young economists who were really thinking of the ways forward. So I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this year's event as well, even virtually. And I think you're going to manage to make it very interesting and innovative, despite all the constraints that we all face. So I also am really happy that you chose this particular topic, because you know, a lot of the COVID-19 kinds of discussions have really been about economic policy rather than the pedagogy and the research that we do and how this particular moment should affect our research. There's been relatively little discussion of that. There have been some interesting and I would say very useful assessments of it. There's a very interesting piece by Ingrid Kwan-Graven and Carolina Alves, which I would recommend to everybody. Maybe I will try and put the link in later when I finish speaking so that everyone can access it. Talking about how this whole pandemic should really force economics into a different direction. But other than that, I think there's not enough about how we in the developing world really need to think about what we do and how we practice our teaching and research. So there are just a few points I'd like to make, and they're really just in the nature of my preliminary thoughts on this, because I know that we're going to be followed by amazing people to talk about this, and I'm sure, given what I've seen of the participants, I'm so happy that so many of them are here, that we get to get very interesting discussion from the participants as well. So my first point is, and I think this is kind of obvious, I'm just restating it just to put it out there and put it aside, which is that the policy distortions caused by neoliberal hegemony have been exposed massively. But what has been, I think, for me, remarkable and shocking is that these have continued into the pandemic. So 6 months or 7 months since the pandemic really impacted all of our countries, we are seeing the continuation of practices that have already hollowed out the ability of our states to deal with any shocks, much less health disasters like this one, and certainly shocks like the climate change changes that are already upon us. So we have a major and necessary critique of macroeconomic policy. And I think that critique has been well developed. It's certainly the REFA discussions of last year, or across the board, we know Institute of Economic Justice has been putting out excellent critiques of the South African policies, fiscal and other. Nonetheless, this hegemony continues. Now, a very large part of this hegemony is actually because of the research and teaching that people have undergone. Policymakers, economists in universities, everywhere. The mainstream continues to think of the standard, completely wrong macroeconomic paradigm whereby you emphasize fiscal discipline and conservatism for developing countries in particular, no matter what the conditions are. And even in situations where there is a real problem of inadequate demand and where you don't necessarily face problems of balance of payments constraints or external debt issues that could constrain your policy. Even there, you exercise unnecessary fiscal discipline and you continue to hollow out the possibility of government interventions and even the government institutions that could cope with the shocks that we know are only going to grow in size and intensity. So this policy failure, which all of us have been critiquing, and I think critiquing well, but we don't have the political heft, let's admit it, to actually force changes. They are limited. These critiques are limited because of the fact that we're not able to make sufficient dent in the economics pedagogy, I would argue. And that, of course, then also transmits into the fact that not enough research is done to establish how clearly wrong a lot of this is. But there are more fundamental issues. It's not just the macro policy, which is, of course, terribly wrong and wrongly oriented in many of our countries. But there are more fundamental critiques, which we really must use this moment to shift to. There is the whole problem of the notion of value in economics. What constitutes value? The continuing reliance on GDP as a useful measure. When all of us who use it, many of us certainly, recognize how flawed it is, not just conceptually, but even empirically how flawed it is. In countries with large informal sectors, a lot of it is based on guesstimates. There are so many things that it leaves out, so many things that it wrongly measures, so many aspects of well-being that it doesn't capture or that it wrongly estimates. So we continue to use GDP and we continue to ascribe to it a value, which supposedly is an objective value, but it ends up being normative. It ends up being something that is privileged over other aspects of well-being. And of course, related to that is the notion of productivity, which is GDP per worker, which again becomes meaningless because not only do we wrongly value GDP, but we also wrongly value work and workers. We take as workers only those who are recognized and employed. We do not recognize unpaid workers. We do not recognize the entire aspects of social reproduction or even productive work that is not counted because it's performed by women, children, and those who are not seen as employed. We do not recognize the environment and the critical role that economic activity plays in destroying aspects of the environment, in over-extraction of nature, or in polluting and other activities that damage our environment. We give a low value to care work when we know that that is not just socially necessary, but that it can have hugely destructive economic consequences if we do not value care. Whereas we value finance, we value the monopolies created over knowledge by intellectual property rights that are a completely new legal construct. So the notion of value has, I think, to be not just critiqued, but we have to fundamentally stand it on its head, and in our teaching as well as our research. And so that's one major area, I think, where we have to focus. I think the second area that is now obvious is the whole issue of work and employment. I've touched on it already in terms of what we think of as productive work versus the work that is integrated into systems of capital and is seen as employment and productive employment. We really have to rethink all of that, and related to that, of course, the productivity of this work, which is defined as the paid output that it produces rather than the social contribution. And again, we have to rethink that, and we have to rethink how we teach it as well, because the more we persist in using the standard mainstream textbooks and using those, the more we end up creating students who see anything else as an aberration rather than as the norm in terms of actually what is important work or socially necessary work versus paid employment. I think we have to recognize also in our teaching, that's the third area that we really have neglected a lot, the phenomenon of interlinked markets between economies, but also within economies. Interestingly, this is actually recognized only in global finance. A lot of the financial work is very obsessed with spillovers, with market interlinkages, with contagion, with those kinds of things that recognize cross-border interlinkages. But we do not sufficiently recognize these interlinkages in other markets, nor do we recognize them within economies, within national economies, and how they are interlinked. Now, one major aspect of this interlinkage is the fact that they all reflect power imbalances. And so I think the fourth point I would like to make is that economics is fundamentally about power imbalances. Yet we tend to iron that away. We tend to kind of exclude it from a lot of certainly what we teach. We do not bring it in explicitly in terms of how we recognize how markets function, how government policies are shaped, the institutions work, all in terms of power imbalances. And of course, these power imbalances are certainly between classes. They are also between across gender, they're across social category, they're across localities where you are based, rural, urban, forested area, etc., across ethnic groups and internationally. And of course, within capital also, large versus small capital, global capital versus domestically oriented capital, and so on and so forth. All of these power imbalances are absolutely critical, but we do not pay adequate attention to that. And we certainly don't bring it into our teaching openly and explicitly from the very beginning. I think we need to do that. We also have to look at legal institutions and laws and the legal codes that shape and reinforce and accentuate these power imbalances. So I think a lot of thinking about power has to come back into our study of analysis of economics. It's interesting that the early economists, not just the classicals as we know them, but the pre-classical canon in Europe and elsewhere, made the recognition of power a very critical part of their understanding of how economics works. I think we have to bring that back very actively. And finally, I think we have to also reduce the obsession with the micro, especially in development economics. There's a whole, the global poverty industry, if I might call it that, the global poverty and development industry has now got really obsessed with the micro and with specific conditions and with looking at incentives and how you can nudge people, there are RCTs looking at how you can shift incentives around to make people behave in ways that would be supposedly better for them, without recognition of context, of history, of institutions, and of power imbalances. And I think that's a terrible shift in the discipline that has really impoverished the discipline. We have to move back away from that into looking at evolutions, at processes, and at macro pictures. What does all this mean? These are the 5 areas I think that we have to think about in terms of big fundamental changes in our research and pedagogy. But what does it mean? It means we have to rethink the syllabi, for one thing. You know, the standard economic syllabi that we have, micro, macro, statistics, development, international economics, economic history. No, we have to rethink all of that. And I think the way we are teaching now is actually putting people into these little kinds of silos and say, oh, well, I do micro and I do this. And then you don't really think about all of the kinds of issues that I've raised. So maybe we have to rethink the syllabi, not just how we structure courses, but also bring in much more of the way in which the processes that I mentioned above actually play out. And, you know, bring in the law of law, legal codes, institutions, structures, not that, you know, you're doing institutional economics and therefore you will look at this, but that when you're looking at any macroeconomic process, you will remember that there are legal codes, institutions, cultural attributes, and power imbalances that are affecting all of those processes. I think it's worth our remembering that some of the best, most relevant and innovative work today is not coming from economists. It's coming from lawyers. Katerina Pistor, who wrote the Code of Capital, I think it's one of the most important books about the economy to come out in the past decade. You have young people who have worked in finance or have worked, you know, who don't really have mainstream economics training, who are better at understanding what the US Fed is doing. Nathan Tankus, for example, who runs this blog, which is very, very influential now, who doesn't have that mainstream training, and therefore is able to think innovatively and in a more relevant way, creatively, about how economies actually function. And I think that's an important lesson for us. Finally, I would say, just, you know, as somebody who has worked for decades in the developing world, we have to have more confidence in ourselves and in the work that is done in the developing world. We have to be more conscious of trying to seek each other out, looking at the work done in other developing countries, finding inspiration from that, disseminating that, making that more known globally. I think that's a very important part of how we have to restructure our syllabi and our research. But I've already gone on for longer than I expected. I apologize. And let me stop here.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that very insightful contribution that you made. I have taken quite a few notes myself that I think match some questions that might arise. So we can get to that later. But can we please get Fatimah to come on next?
There we go. Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
That's great. Thank you, Seho. I really appreciate that. And thank you so much, Jayati, for your presentation. Just listening to so much of it, actually, I'm thinking to myself, all right, I do not want to go over the same ground, because I absolutely agree with essentially everything that you've said so far. And so I suppose what I'll do is try my best to give it some slightly different shade based on my own experiences, working within this space as an African feminist, working in the economic sphere, and essentially what I've seen pan out over the last 20 years, actually. So we are talking about COVID in this COVID moment, but I think it's important for us to take that longer view of these things. So I think the first thing to acknowledge really is, yeah, the moment is disruptive. We know this. It has forced us to pause, most literally in this case, in a way that perhaps we haven't done before. And it forces us to question. And this has happened a lot. You know, we've had these moments before. The financial crisis of 2008 is perhaps one of the most notable examples. And this led to much needed critical analysis in order to understand what went wrong, why it's happened, what the inherent flaws are within the economic system, what should be done differently, you know, and all of that has came out. But this analysis has been done for ages. So it's been going on for decades, you know, before the credit crisis and before this pandemic. But what these moments do is they lead to a highlighting and an amplification of what has already been a reimagining of African economies by many different people, but often those outside of the orthodox institutions where economics are taught. And, you know, speaking again of the credit crisis, the moment came and then it passed. And the neoliberal way of doing things remained largely unaltered and in many ways came back stronger. And this ties into what Jayati was saying, that, you know, the hegemony has continued regardless. You know, and I think it's important to kind of really look at what that means I'll give you a really interesting example of some of the stuff that came out after the credit crisis. So I don't know if you can all actually see this publication here. So it's, okay, I'll read it out to you because you've got it on Mirror View. It's Harvesting Feminist Knowledge for Public Policy. It's an anthology by Devaki Jain and Diane Elson. Fantastic pieces in there, one by an African feminist economist, Yassine Fall, that looked at the commodification of water and energy and food with a focus on Senegal. And, essentially that book, this book was something that I came across in like 2012, 2013. It came out in 2011 and started using it. And, in various libraries, I decided to purchase a secondhand copy because I couldn't afford the real deal. And what I got, interestingly, was a secondhand copy that had come from the Said Business School Library at the University of Oxford. And it's got a big fat withdrawn like sticker on it. Again, I could show it to you, but you'll just see the inverse view. And for me, this really summed up, kind of sitting here in 2020, what the scenario actually was in terms of the way this fantastic knowledge had now just sort of petered out and was not dominant within the sphere in any way. And I'm sure even at the time, it probably didn't make it into the spaces that it needed to. So this time around, the last 8 months, we've seen a mushrooming of research, statements that have unpacked the problems within current economic policy trajectories and how these have exacerbated the pandemic. And they've also offered concrete alternative approaches that African countries need to seriously consider, not simply relegate to the margins of being unsound and being, dangerously heterodox. One example of this is the African feminist post-COVID economic recovery statement, which was pulled together by African feminists across the continent who've been working on these issues for many decades. You can find it on the website African Feminisms if you're interested. The statement unpacked how the gender dimensions of prevailing policy prescriptions are still not acknowledged or considered, how the current models have become dependent on an exploitation of women's labor, as Jayati has already spoken about, and how the unpaid care sort of arena alone subsidizes entire economies, for example, women's greater fiscal vulnerability and how they fundamentally carry the economic tab, in the instance of economic fallout right across the board, but also how this neoclassical model of economic development, is uninterested in addressing the structural inequalities that uphold those vulnerabilities. And so then the question we have to ask ourselves in this moment is, can this new moment be a genuine turning point away from those orthodox trajectories and learning models of economic development? And is this a moment for reimagining the economy within those institutions that are responsible for essentially bringing out our economists? Can we bring in really meaningful analysis of solidarity economics, well-being economics models that, place well-being and people's, well-being at the heart of economies and doesn't just see them as units of production or as consumers? And I think more broadly, as a Pan-African feminist, is this a moment where really we can actually have a solidarity politics between African nations? Because I think this is something that has also been dangerously missing from the way in which we engage with economic development as individual countries and more broadly as a continent. But for this to happen, the current narratives around what are viable economic trajectories need to change. And this has to happen first and foremost at the educational institutional level. Part of the problem, obviously, is that the neoclassical, the neoliberal model is posited as being politically neutral. And it's anything but. The fact that austerity policies, cuts in state-owned, more universally available essential services, an example, uphold that model is proof of this. And that is a political choice. Now, the insidious reality of that, to be honest with you, is something that everyone, especially economists and economists in training, should be wary and afraid of. Now, I am not an economist, but I've had a fair bit of time over the last 20 years engaging with those who have been trained as economists at one level or another. And, working across trade, budgets, markets, agricultural development, I have come into contact, worked with, and also clashed with economists. And they kind of fall into two camps for me, so this is very much drawing on my own experience. Those who have become disillusioned by how narrow their training was, lack of plurality, frustrations, and have then become consigned to a place where they are no longer listened to. And they carry the stigma of heterodoxy, which is in some respects the quickest way to lose your job. And then those who are completely unaware that there are alternatives, or indeed of the fallacies and hypocrisies within the dominant model that they have been taught is gospel. And I think gospel is the key word here. So there are various examples of this: working in trade in 2007, working with trade policy specialists, looking at the EU ACP economic partnership agreements, acknowledging within those meetings that trade liberalization is dangerously damaging to economies, and especially at the speed at which that was being offered, but then having zero ability to offer or envisage alternatives because the training was not there. Working on budgets and seeing accepted incursions of private finance into essential services. On the one hand, this is seen as a reprieve from fiscal spaces that are already too tight and deeply indebted. But then on the other, there was this wholehearted belief by many of those I worked with who felt that, who bought into the rhetoric of private sector efficiency. And what constitutes efficiency, the so-called efficiency, is never questioned. So profit motivated decision making that can ruthlessly cut jobs in the preservation of a bottom line. And then also the evidence that public-private finance is anything but efficient, is never really looked into. And there's enough evidence, particularly from the global north in countries like the UK, where there's been a lot of engagement of public-private partnerships, and yet that evidence is either not known or just simply ignored because it doesn't fit in with the dominant model. And today COVID-19 has actually exposed how our negligence towards defending spending on public services on the continent and goods, they've left our health systems further shattered as a result of the pandemic. And then, if you look at the agricultural sector, and this is an area that I have spent a lot of time working in over the last 5 years in particular, there's the blind commitment to green revolution policies under AGRA, the Alliance on Green Revolution in Africa. And it's interesting, the former Director General of the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, Jose Graziano da Silva, actually called it the cathedral of the Green Revolution. And I think the use of this religious terminology of reverence is not wrong and actually underpins the risks an individual faces when challenging that paradigm within an economic institution, possibly even an educational institution. And that's despite the evidence that not only has green revolutions not solved hunger and have been harmfully extractive and damaging to biodiversity, climate resilience, destabilized and corroded the lives of the most vulnerable, particularly the rural poor, and yet still that adherence to this cathedral is dominant within the African continent at the moment. Other models such as agroecological approaches, of which there is a flourishing evidence base now in parts of Europe, in Canada, is completely, again, sort of not making its way into our educational and policy spaces. And then of course, overall, there's the temple of growth, right? Which Jayati has already spoken on. Not only is there a lack of acknowledgement, the fact that growth has not eradicated poverty, but the inequality within Africa has deepened even as our economies have grown. As a Nigerian, with the so-called largest economy, I feel this inconsistency deeply. I remember when it was announced that we had the fastest growing economy and the largest economy on the continent. I mean, seriously, in Nigeria and even in the diaspora, the response was like tumbleweed, kind of, rolling down the street, because lived realities, it meant nothing. It meant absolutely nothing. And I remember a time when pro-poor growth was posited as the answer to the, sort of the challenges to the growth paradigm. And, as a feminist who's kind of, been working on women's economic empowerment in particularly, seeing how women's empowerment has been made instrumental to growth has been deeply disturbing. And the rhetoric of gender equality and gender mainstreaming has been fed into that. And again, this has led to a focusing on micro level economics, as Jayati said, and this keeps us away from the larger macro issues that need to be addressed: tax justice, debt, fiscal spending. And it has also led to a promulgation of economic individualism through a focus on entrepreneurialism, women being asked to effectively entrepreneur themselves out of poverty. The sum total in that respect has been an instrumentalization of African women's bodies, which, as Africa becomes more and more covetously viewed for extractive purposes, will no doubt deepen. There's no questioning as to whether that growth itself as a model is problematic, that it's inherently extractive in nature. And so this is never questioned. So inequality, that remains regardless of growth is, again, not fundamentally tackled. So the question that we need to be asking ourselves as a continent is, whose development trajectory are we really trying to mimic? And this is something I'm constantly talking about whenever I engage with economists, trade specialists, agronomists. And, I always try to take the example of, countries I think that the continent looks to as an example of where we want to be in 50 years time, the US, the UK, and that's all kind of scary. So let's, let me take the US as an example, and let's look at this COVID moment. So today we look at that model as where we want to be, a fast food store in every corner, cars everywhere, roads with traffic lights that work, right? These are some of the things that have been said to me, not just, by everybody, really. They also have one of the most scientifically advanced healthcare systems in the world, right? And yet there have been more deaths from COVID in the US than anywhere else. And these follow race lines, class lines, poverty lines. I think 207,000 deaths was what I checked this morning. 207,000 deaths. As someone who's worked, in the Caribbean and small island states, this is like 4 or 5, sort of small states. So these numbers are astounding. And, the most vulnerable have been hung out to dry by a health system that is brutally linked to an economy that has placed the onus of well-being and health completely on the individual. Jobs are not just being lost or cut down, but also the health insurance that are tied to these jobs follow class lines, race lines, poverty lines, mean that many people have been left completely without access to healthcare in the most developed country in the world, in the largest economy in the world, in the economy that we all allegedly want to be in, a period of time. Is this the economic development we want? And this is the question that we need to be asking in our spaces, in our institutions. And if we believe in an African economic trajectory that is resolutely our own, then we have to have a more pluralist approach to the teaching and learning of economics in Africa. And that means not just pulling in different economic models of thought, but actually bringing in everybody to have a view on this. Everybody engages with the economy in an everyday manner, and everybody is taking everyday decisions on the economy. I think it was Ha-Joon Chang who said the economy is far too important to be left to economists alone, and that includes me. And I think this is actually where we need to be in terms of the way we really rethink and reimagine where our learning and teaching of economics could go on the continent. And I think most importantly, we do have a crisis of power, and I haven't spoken about power in great depth because I think Jayati covered that really well. But we also have a crisis of dreaming on the continent, a crisis of envisioning, and we need to fix that quite quickly. And I'm hoping that this moment will not be one that's lost. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. There was so much that I pulled out there, very insightful, and I think that it's got some people thinking, seeing some questions coming in. So thank you for that. Can we move on to Professor Leonce?
Yes. Hold on.
You can go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Am I on? Do you see me? Do you see my screen?
Yes, both. Yes to both.
Okay. This is the trouble with Zoom. You're talking and you don't know if anybody is listening. So first of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this edition of the Rethinking Economics for Africa Festival. This is my first participation, my first time to participate. I have already really learned a lot from the presentation from my two colleagues, Jayati and Fatimah. And they really have shown that we have a real challenge to make economics useful for not just dealing with guiding decisions to deal with the crisis, but really to deal with, to guide policy in solving the fundamental problems that our economies face. The coronavirus only highlighted some of the major flaws in the system, but the issues we face are not new. So we need really to think very critically about how relevant our approaches to economics are as a useful discipline, if it has to be useful. And in fact, I want to just re-emphasize the fact that economics is a powerful discipline. If you look at what the decisions are being made, they are inspired by the work of economists. I mean, who is the most influential policymaker in every country? It's a minister of finance, it's a central bank governor, it's people in charge of ministries of planning. And those are informed and inspired by the things we do as economists. Whether they were trained in economics or not, that's what eventually ends up happening. So in my presentation, what I wanted to do was to look at how we think about teaching economics and look at two particular things, which are first, the need to globalize our thinking of economics. When I teach macro, intermediate or graduate, I tell my students that even though we are in the US, and I can tell you textbooks in macro in the US are about the US economy or marginally about other OECD countries. I tell them, you can't understand macro unless you make it global, until you go to the rest of the world. Otherwise it doesn't make sense. But also for development, you can't think of development policy or development research in any particular country without looking at the global context. Otherwise you're really getting a truncated vision of the world. And the other point I want to emphasize on, focus on, is the need to contextualize, because developing countries, all countries, have their own structural features. They have their own structural constraints that need to be taken into account in first understanding how they get affected by crisis like the coronavirus, but also how what kind of tools and instruments they have to address the crisis. So I will be illustrating with two issues that I have been working on. Jayati will be able to come in, because one of them, both of us, with our colleagues, are trying to scratch our heads and see how we can inform policy in this area. It's about taxation policy. And just to illustrate how economics is limited in thinking about that, about policy, making it focusing on the local context, when in fact the global context has an impact in how your local policy is effective or not effective. So that's what I'll be talking about, and try to watch my time, and if I go over, just tell me to stop. So we have a global system which has a lot of flaws in the way it is organized. And because of those flaws, it really undermined the inclusiveness of local policy. We have been talking about how developing countries are facing this severe problem of inequality, unequal distribution of wealth, unequal distribution of the gains from growth, for example. One of the ways you correct those unequal outcomes is to use policy tools to redistribute the gains from growth. And one of them is taxation. So tax policy, in fact, can be a tool for inclusive development in terms of mobilizing resources from those who have income and wealth, and use those resources to redistribute. Of course, we know even in developed countries, this function is very ineffective. In fact, taxation policy takes from those who don't have and give to those who have. We have presidents who pay no taxes when they are billionaires. But in cases where the government is able to actually mobilize tax revenue, that's a big tool for redistributing through investment in public infrastructure, investment in public services, and financing social transfers. Also, when you structure your tax policy appropriately, it helps to shift the burden upwards in the distribution of income by having those who have more money and wealth to pay more. So that, again, in principle, that's how tax policy should work. Is it how it is working, and how is the global financial system and economic system, trading system, helping or undermining the ability of governments to run their tax policies? What we're facing now is a global system that really undermines taxation. So you have a global trading and finance system that's basically controlled by a few big mega corporations, which I call stateless enterprises, in the same that they don't have an identity, they don't have a nationality, they are not accountable to anybody because they are everywhere and nowhere. That allows them to evade tax, avoid tax. I still can't understand why avoiding tax is not a bad thing. People tell me it's not a bad thing. But, and this tax evasion and tax avoidance erodes the base for taxation that governments can use, are supposed to use to mobilize resources. And with the information technology revolution, the digital economy has made this even more complicated to tax global corporations. You have heard about companies like Google, Amazon, which are everywhere and are not paying taxes to nobody. And that's a big challenge. And if you look at who benefits from that, it's the mega corporations. And which countries benefit from that? It's the developed countries where those corporations are headquartered, because that's where the capital is being intermediated in their financial system. There's an interesting study done by Tax Justice Network, which was an attempt to look at the losses in tax revenue from corporate tax evasion. And you will not be surprised that developing countries shoulder the biggest burden of tax evasion. Here you have the top 50 countries with the largest tax losses, and almost all of them are African. Are you surprised? I'm not. I recall a study by what is that? It's not. I remember the author. It's an NGO based in London. It was an investigative analysis of tax evasion by SAB Miller, one of the biggest beer companies. If anybody remembers the author, you can type it in the chat room. And they found that SAB Miller was paying very low taxes in African countries where it operates. In fact, in the case of Ghana, they found that the company, the subsidiary of SAB Miller in Ghana, was paying less tax than a woman who was running a beer stand on a street. That woman was paying more taxes on her beer than SAB Miller. That shows you how really compromised the global taxation system is. Now, why does that matter in the context of the COVID? One is this is a crisis as like all other major crises that requires a vigorous intervention by governments, national governments, and other governments. And taxation is one of the tools that governments will be using to mobilize resources to combat the crisis, but also to stimulate the economy in a post-crisis recovery. Unfortunately, these practices of multinational corporations evading taxes undermine these efforts. And because, again, these multinational corporations have a lot of power, economic and political, and also they are also backed and supported by the governments in their headquarters. And that makes it difficult for developing countries, African countries, to to really discipline these institutions, which means that we need a global partnership in disciplining these international corporations. And again, as I said, Jayati and I are on the ICRICT, which is International Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, where we're trying to really look at how flawed the international taxation system is and what could be done in improving the system. Okay, so then I'm going to give you a second example of how the global financial system undermines local policy. And this is one of the topics I spend a lot of my time working on, which is illicit financial flows. And specifically, I want to touch on the issue of banking secrecy. Again, how do we teach money and banking? How do we teach macro? How do we teach monetary economics? That banks are there to efficiently mobilize resources and allocate to the best users, okay, in a very competitive way. And if that is done, then you'll see that capital is going to be allocated to the best use, the highest return of investment. From a global perspective, that means that money, capital would move to the best use, to the highest return to investment. Is that how it really works? No. We see that, in fact, capital moves upstream as opposed to going downstream, in the sense that it's moving from developing countries where it is in short supply and also where the returns to capital are much higher, to offshore financial centers in developed countries where the returns to investment are very low. I mean, look at the interest rates in the US, in Europe, it's zero. But you still see that capital is moving from Africa to the US, from Africa to Europe, from Africa to the secrecy jurisdictions, where in fact it's not earning much, where it would earn much more in African countries in terms of return to investment, the jobs created, and so on. But the problem is that this phenomenon of capital flight or illicit financial flows in general is facilitated by a very strong, intricate global network of enablers, as we call them: banks, law firms, accounting firms, consulting firms, who work with corporations and elite members of the political, political elite and economic elite to move money in contravention with government rules and governing transfers, capital transfers across borders. And this system is very, very, very incentive compatible, in the sense that those who have political power benefit from the system. So they will always, they will make sure that to preserve the status quo, they will combat any efforts to reform the system. The issue is that when a system like that, which is opaque, not transparent, is not allocating resources to the best use, the issue is that the gains from financial intermediation across the world are very uneven. The losers are the developing countries where the money is coming from, and also the second group of losers are the working people, and here globally, developing countries and in the developed world, because unfortunately working people cannot hide their money. If you work for a salary, your tax is known and you'll pay taxes, and you cannot move it to the Bahamas. That's how it is. But those who corporations can move their money anywhere they want, and they will avoid taxes. They will avoid any levies as they wish. And then, again, as I said, the global governance structure is really set up in a way that undermines and marginalizes the developing countries. If you look at policies today, they are being done in the context of what I call elite clubs, the G20, the G7, but never in the global bodies like the UN, which are more transparent and participatory. So these are the two examples I wanted to give about how it's not helpful really to do economics from a closed economic context. It doesn't work. So in terms of teaching points, quickly, I'm already over my time. One is, I said, the importance of contextualizing. One, when we look at African countries, yes, we have celebrated the resurgence of growth over time, especially in the turn of the century.
I think that we.
What? Excuse me? Hello?
Oh, there we go.
Do we have a problem?
You carry on. No, carry on, Leonce. You can.
Yeah. Okay. So we have seen African countries accelerate growth over the past 2 decades in the turn of the century. But the issue we face now in African countries is clearly resilience to shocks and the sustainability of growth. I don't have to elaborate. Jayati and Fatimah have said a lot about the fact that growth has not benefited from everybody. But in the case of African countries, the COVID has really unveiled a really big troublesome feature of the economies, which is informality and the precarity of livelihoods. In the US, like now I'm working from my home, businesses are working remotely. How do you do that in countries where 60–70% of the economy is informal, where people need to go to the street, need to go to the job, to the market to make a living? It's simply not possible. That means that they are not prepared to absorb shocks like these ones. The other is, again, inequality and distribution. We have to think about inequality and distribution as a constraint to growth, in the sense that unless you redistribute a priori, unless you integrate everybody in the economic system, you will not have a resilient growth. So it's not that let's wait until the economy will grow and one day there will be equal distribution. No, it has to be built into the policy, the policies and the strategy. The other thing that needs to be, again, has been brought to light is the role of fiscal policy for counter-cyclical intervention, but also for crisis management. Again, the economics we teach is always about balancing the budget is the best way to go. That's what they tell you. A deficit is bad. You should reduce the deficit. You should raise taxes, cut expenditures. Now, at this time, it's clear that the fiscal deficit is not a bad thing if the government, in fact, is borrowing or spending to weather the storm in the crisis, support livelihoods, support businesses. It's always what I say when I teach economic development, that developed countries always want developing countries to do the things they cannot do themselves, that they have never done. Can anybody tell me which country has the highest deficit in the world? It's not a developing country, it's a developed country, but nobody talks about that. The other is debt. Yes, debt could be an issue if it is not well used, but tightening your belt by not borrowing at the time of crisis is completely suicidal. African countries should be able to leverage their borrowing capacity to support the economies through the crisis. Then in terms of the other point I was emphasizing, which is globalizing. Again, what do we teach in economics? We say, okay, now this part of the lecture is about the economy in the context of a closed economy, and then we're going to look at open economy. I mean, open economy courses are separate from domestic. It doesn't work that way, because even your local policy, like taxation policy, is going to be constrained by the global economic system. Again, there is no point in trying to discuss how you react to crisis if you don't understand that there is crises are not confined within the borders of an economy. There is a lot of contagion across borders. The other point I was trying to make is the unequal distribution of globalization. When we teach economics and international trade, trade is good for everybody. Open trade is good for everybody. Globalization is good for everybody. It hasn't been good for African countries. African countries are still stuck at the bottom of the value chain. Industrialization policy for a long time was considered as taboo. But we see that African governments that have taken it seriously are actually making some progress. I can give examples. Ethiopia, where I lived a little for some time, and I use in my classes. In governments that have decided to do it their way and adapt their own needs, you can begin to see progress in expanding the production space, in creating new industries, supporting new industry, where a government is actively intervening to support the private sector. When we teach money and banking, we talk about portfolio choice theory, that, yeah, financial systems are going to allocate resources equitably and efficiently. That's not what I see when I look at the movement of capital from African countries to the rest of the world. And then repeating what my two colleagues have said, the issue of global distribution of power. I think when we teach economics, we rarely think about power, both domestically but globally. When we look at how policy is made locally and globally, it's all constrained by who has the power, who imposes the power, both economics and political. So unless we get a change in the structure of governance across around the world, it's going to be difficult for African countries to have a seat at the table when they have to discuss policies that affect their own people. Thank you so much, and sorry for going on too long. I hope I didn't send everybody to sleep.
No, not at all. Thank you so much. I thought we might have lost you there right in the middle when you were getting to the meat of the conversation, and I was so scared. So thank you very much. There was a lot to take from there. A lot of questions came in as well. So I think that this is the perfect moment to move on to the question and answers. And I've picked out a few, and people in the audience, please do keep them coming. So I think that in terms of the questions, I'll pose them in the order of the discussions that we had. So the first question will go to Jayati. And there was a question that came in from Josh Rosenberg, which was that universities in the Global South usually teach a Global North curriculum because they believe that they have to be globally competitive. How can we disrupt this? There was also another question sort of to do with this about, so how can we move towards the disruption of this prioritization of the Global North? And I think that refers to sort of pragmatic ways as well. And then for Fatimah, the question that came was, it's very similar to the question that was posed to Jayati, in that what is the best way to get our students? So yeah, this was very much focused on like student participation. How do we as students challenge neoliberal thinking? Since you spoke about how neoliberalism has kind of been depoliticized, and where can we focus our advocacy at a local institutional level? And then there was also a question on your comment on envisioning and dreaming in Africa, and what is the barriers to us doing that? And lastly, Leonce, we had a few questions about tax. So one question was, how do we get citizens to buy into the importance of tax when the fiscal contract is undermined by mismanagement of state funds? So how do we effectively combat taxpayer despondency? And then we had a question from Nolo about the overtaxation of the middle class, which results in a missing middle, and how do we overcome that? And lastly, on your comment, okay, I think this can be if we have some time left, but your comment on how powerful the Minister of Finance and Treasury are, and how do young people who want to bring in more heterodox approaches, how do we begin to engage with national policy makers considering the context that we kind of live in? So yeah, lots of questions about how we essentially go about creating some sort of radical reform to what the system is right now. So yeah, I hope that was clear, and we have a few more questions coming in. So yeah, just you can organize your thoughts across those questions, and then we can see if we have some time for another round of questions. So can we start with Jayati?
Great. Thank you so much, Sego.
Cool.
So, you know, I noticed I was also looking at some of these questions as they were coming in, and many of them are really about, okay, what do we do? How do we change this? Yes, and especially because of the fact, you know, how do we influence I think somebody talked about reluctant colonial subjects in the South, and how we are, you know, reinforcing this powers imbalance between North and South in the way that we do the economics to be globally competitive and so on. So here's the thing. I don't want to underestimate the size of the challenge. It is enormous, because the power imbalances that I was talking about also exist within the discipline. They exist between North and South for sure, but they also exist across mainstream and any alternative. And it's a very tight system. It's very tightly controlled. There are the gatekeepers in terms of the journals. There is the attempt of all university to establish so-called higher ratings, and the ratings are based on, you know, whether you publish in an A or B or C or D kind of journal. And these journals, which is A or B or C, are decided by a small group of essentially power brokers in the global North, who are trying to impose a particular view of the economy. So it's working at multiple levels. It's, you know, students have to get jobs. They need to publish. If you publish in an A journal, you get more points than if you do in a D or something. So yes, of course, you will be pushed into or incentivized into doing the kind of research that will get published and then get a job. So, and you can't blame a student, in fact, for this, because the world is tough out there and jobs are scarce and so on. So there is a very big problem in terms of the way university administrators think, especially in economics, which presents itself as a science when it's not. And where, you know, you cannot claim that the articles in journal A type are necessarily of better quality or more relevant or more useful or even lead to better understanding. And where some of the most important research in economics has actually come not from all of those, you know, so-called top journals, but from all kinds of other things which have become you know, very, very important and they've been picked up from relatively non-mainstream, outlandish sometimes journals because of the significance of the points that they're making. Now, how do you deal with that? That's a very big one. And I don't say that I have an answer, but I do think that, you know, in a sense, economics is digging its own grave as it gets further and further away from reality, as it continues to push the views of a dominant elite rather and the perspectives that they want to promote rather than alternatives, the less and less relevance it has even for businesses, to be honest. I have talked to so many businessmen who say that, look, when we look for economic analysis, we don't go to economics departments, we go to business schools, because in fact, business schools are forced to actually represent reality. Okay, from an employer perspective, a business perspective, but they can't get away from the reality. And the business schools also hire economic historians. They hire historians of economic thought. They hire psychologists. Somebody was talking about interdisciplinary. They hire sociologists. They hire people who bring different perspectives, because unfortunately, that's how economies work, through all of these things. So I think one is that, in a sense, you know, the sort of internal contradictions of mainstream economics are becoming more and more evident and felt, and that, to some extent, I think would ease the challenge that we face. But the other is really that students play a huge role. And I think we've seen that in Europe, the rise of the post-autistic movement in economics, as it was called, translated into real-world economics. A lot of that is actually forcing a lot more change among policymakers as well. I think that kind of thing emerging, I think REFA is a wonderful example, where you're creating much more awareness and noise around different perspectives. And as those perspectives, it becomes evident that they are actually able to provide more relevant answers to the pressing questions of today, you will get more people actually willing to take them on. So I think students can play a very huge role. It seems overwhelming. I think somebody mentioned that it's very easy to feel despondent with these overwhelming and multiple crises that are facing, especially the younger generation. And we have to recognize that the COVID pandemic and the policy responses have been extremely destructive, particularly for the youth, particularly for younger generation who, can really face this combined attack of livelihood crisis and all other crises together. So it's easy to feel despondent. And here I would say that, it's often the case that the darkest hour is just before dawn and all of those other cliches, but I think that's true. I think basically, over history, we have seen that humanity steps back from the brink. And let's face it, we're at the brink. So, there is much more traction and possibilities now for humanity to step back if we have that kind of confidence. That's not easy. It's not something you can do individually, but there is a much greater power of the collective. I think that's the broad point I would make about how do you deal with this very big internal power imbalance within the discipline of economics. On the North versus South thing, really we need much more self-confidence. I find my students, they, when they write their thesis, the references are all to people located in the North, even when actually the ideas and concepts and everything are stuff that we have taught them. But everything comes from the North. We have to get out of this. We have to actually be more self-confident and be willing to not just learn from one another, but recognize that we are learning from one another and put it out there. And then perhaps everybody else will also take cognizance of that. There are some questions that came for Leonce on taxation, and as he mentioned, he and I have been working together in this commission. So I'm going to leave them to him, but I think, somebody had asked a question that, is there a kind of narrow collection of neoclassical ideas that we should drop to make space for the heterodox? So I don't think we drop them from the textbooks, but we write textbooks to show how these concepts are meaningless. I think Leonce is going to talk about some of those for fiscal policy. The whole idea that there's a Laffer curve kind of behavior in tax policy, for example, which should be put there simply to refute because it's so stupid and wrong. But let's take something which in Africa is a very big issue, comparative advantage in trade, and how you should countries should be moving towards the things that they have comparative advantage in. So look at the theory that underlies that. It is static, it's not dynamic. It is based on perfect competition and full employment. The entire model collapses if you drop the assumptions of perfect competition and full employment, which never exist. So why are we not saying that? Why do none of the textbooks ever mention that, in fact, this has no relevance at all to any African developing country or any developing country because it assumes perfect competition, full employment, and is static? We should mention these. We shouldn't drop them, but we should say, hey, these theories suck. They are not important. So spend maybe 2 lectures on them and then move on to the theories that do help us to understand trade. Okay, let me stop here, and I'm sure the others will have much more to say.
Fatimah, you can go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, and you're saying it all really, really well, Jayati. So I'm not sure if I've got any more to say on that, but let me have a look at some of my questions, some of which do overlap. The first one is, how do we, as students, challenge neoliberal thinking? Well, okay, I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, it's quite a simple answer, really, which is to, forearm yourself with as much alternative knowledge as possible. This is the only way that I can actually see that coming about, and to be rigorous with it and to have the evidence in place. There are so many different spaces in which you can get this knowledge. As Jayati said, there are many who are writing on the economy who are not economists per se, but who have done wonderful work and who are actually positing the alternatives, viable alternatives that can be trialed, can be looked at, can be formulated into concrete policy, and use that as the ammunition with which you can actually bring into a space where neoliberal models are dominant and are being taught as if they are neutral and common sense and inverted commas, etc. And I would say, actually, one thing that has been really critical to me in terms of being able to inform the way in which I look at, you know, the study of economics and how I have come to it is as a historian. So my first degree was in history. And so I've taken a historical view of pretty much everything that I touch. And one of the greatest things that can be done in terms of challenging neoliberalism and, you know, more broadly, this whole, you know, syllabus of the North is actually to expose the fallacies of how the global North itself developed and how the policies that are now being pushed on African countries through, you know, the international finance institutions, etc., have not actually occurred in those global northern countries in the same way. I mean, if we even remove the very large factor of imperialism, slavery, etc., which led to industrialization and development and was essentially the underpinning, you know, even in the post-imperial context, you know, the expectations right now that African countries have been given regarding taxation, for example, were not the case in a lot of global northern countries in the 1940s and 50s post-war, when they were also expanding and developing certain sectors. How many of us actually know this as we are being told to shrink the state further and to essentially pull back on that kind of policy trajectory? And I think this is where, you know, sort of being forearmed with alternative approaches as much as you can is critical. And, you know, finding the roots of that are not always easy. Coming to a space like this is one way of doing it. But on the African continent, there are many who are looking into this. You know, organizations like Ciatini, Femnet. You know, Femnet, I think 3 years ago, put out a fantastic paper on illicit financial flows, which I haven't seen anything, you know, really like that elsewhere. And it was from a feminist positioning, but it really dug deep into, you know, that entire phenomenon, I think for the first time in a really meaningful way, and obviously ties in completely to the entire tax justice movement. And then you've got AFSA, which is the Alliance for Sustainable Agriculture in Africa. And, you know, that is essentially challenging the green revolution paradigm in a really meaningful way. You've got organizations across the continent, cooperative movements, you know, farmers who have actually managed to do some really important work. In Senegal, that entire agroecological movement has managed to get, you know, the Senegalese government to a space where it's ready to seriously look at adopting agroecological policy as an alternative to the green revolution paradigm. And, you know, the worry is that, you know, with certain movements on the continent at the moment that are really pushing towards agro-industrialization, for example, you know, that momentum could be lost. And so pulling that evidence out, you know, demonstrating it, showing how, you know, scale can be achieved through agroecological programming is, you know, are the ways in which you can actually combat that. The other question regarding, let me see, where can we focus our advocacy at local levels? So, you know, it varies, obviously, in terms of where you are fundamentally. I'm currently based in the UK, so my sort of focus is looking at what the issues are here in terms of the relationship between the UK government and what it's doing in the African continent. So, you know, right now we have got a situation with the Kenyan government looking to essentially strike a bilateral agreement, trade agreement with the UK as it is trying to do with the US. And all of that is deeply problematic for a variety of reasons. One, because it's going to disrupt regional integration and what that then means in terms of, you know, most favored nation clauses and how we're essentially been making our borders even more porous in the longer term, regardless of whether or not the African Continental Free Trade Agreement actually goes forward. And the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is actually something I haven't spoken on, but I will come back to that in a second, because I think that's also something that we need to look at far more critically than we are doing at the moment. What are the barriers to the crisis of dreaming and the crisis of visioning? So the first is the crisis of power, to be perfectly honest with you. And I think that's been explained quite well in terms of the ways in which, you know, by being powerless, you know, as individuals within institutions, you know, I spoke in my presentation, you know, the quickest way to lose your job is to be seen as a marginal kind of, you know, lefty, heterodox economist who is essentially proposing things that are considered completely unworkable, unviable. You know, we hear about there not being any money trees and all this sort of thing. And essentially you'll just get kicked out of your role. So it is a quiet crisis of power. But then on the other hand, it's also a crisis of knowledge, really. And, you know, and I've spoken about this already. So if you don't know what the alternatives are, and if you don't know what some of the inconsistencies are in the paradigms that you've been taught, you're not going to speak about them. You know, you're not going to be able to fight for them and struggle for them. A very large program I was working on in northern Nigeria on on agriculture. I was dealing with agronomists there, and and it was a market systems approach program, and I had sort of gone in there with the attempt to really try and get them to see to a large extent some of the damage that was being done. So this was a DFID funded program, and this, on a tangential point, is part of the issue also. Some of our best people are being pulled in at a very early age into very large development programs that have come out of the global north, and they are essentially developing their career there. Now these programs, the business cases for them have been developed completely outside of the African continent. So the ideology is already completely baked in before it ever got to us. And then you've got, a young person maybe straight out of university, coming in, they've got this great job, they've got lots of knowledge, they're very efficient, they work well. And now the rest of their, I suppose, ideological socialization is going to happen within that space. So I'm there having a conversation about the Nigerian government subsidy program, the GSS, the agricultural subsidy program, which is a mess because it's horribly implemented. It's, rife with corruption. So it's got all of these flaws. There's no doubt about that. But what I'm being told by an agronomist is that it is a market distortion, and that's why it's a problem. It is essentially distorting the market, and it's not allowing fair competition, etc., etc. So I point out that the program we're in, which has been developed by the UK, and at this time the UK, Brexit hadn't happened yet, so we were looking at about 6 years ago, is a part of the EU, and the EU, along with the US, are the most notorious for agricultural subsidies. That information dropped like it had never been heard before, and that shocked me absolutely to my core. So the belief that somehow global northern countries are operating with the same neoliberal values is actually something that, some of our best minds have somehow been convinced, again, not just within our institutions that have sort of adopted these models, but actually through the career trajectories that then go on to follow, which are largely controlled by extracontinental actors. And then the final one is how to make macroeconomics more inclusive. And so a lot of my work really is working with women's organizations on the continent and trying to demystify, economic thought, economic thinking, for women's organizations to be able to engage in policy spaces on the issues. And a lot of my work in that area has actually been done on trade. So there are a lot of toolkits out there that have already been developed that help to do that, to really break down these issues in order to be able to engage with everybody. And the truth of the matter is, you don't need to have gone to university to be able to talk about any of these issues, and you don't need to have gone to have done an economics course to talk about any of these issues. If you look at trade union movements, for example, that led to the welfare state that the UK is now trying to essentially get rid of, but which led to the stabilization of mortality rates, child death rates, the whole thing came out of a movement where the majority of people were not university educated. These were working class movements with people who understood economic theory back to front. This is, they were working on, sort of on in factories and on lines, that they could talk economic theory with you to the highest level because there was an innate trust that they were not stupid. So I think that's one of the first things we also need to do, is just not to assume that if you haven't gone to university, you must not have the capacity for this. On the doorstep and doing some political campaigning myself, I found that when I actually had conversations with people about tax evasion and the fact that we've got, enormous multinational companies avoiding tax, young people, the age of 23, 24, who had never been to university, had never looked at university as part of their life's sort of, mission, were able to engage with these issues in great detail, and they were shocked that they'd never actually been introduced to this before. So there are ways in which we can do this, both by simplifying, but also just by trusting the fact that people are intelligent, and you don't need to have gone to an educational institution. And just finally, just to talk on the CFTA. So one of the things I've recently done is I'm currently in the middle of finalizing a paper on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement from a Pan-African feminist perspective for the organization Femnet that's based in Nairobi. And again, there, I think when it comes to this issue of regional integration, we have been wanting this for a really long time, right? But we must also be willing to question what seems to be a project that's been developed within the African continent, but actually has been driven by the same model of liberalization externally. And there's a lot of talk at the moment about cooperation within that space, but actually when you look at it, we are still talking about competition between nations. Now, part of the challenge is, if like me, you come out and you say this right now, you are told that you are being a real kind of bar humbug, a real Scrooge against what's being put forward as the beginning of the Pan-African dream. And so you've got to actually have the courage to sometimes question. Because when I look at everything, and I've looked at a lot of the data, there are some real concerns we've got to have there, and we need to have those critiques coming from economists themselves, not just from us on the margins, but also those of us on the margins need to be taken more seriously when we do the analysis and when we look at these things, because fundamentally we're looking at a very brutal liberalization time framework. We are looking at a complete lack of preparedness, particularly by our poorest, least developed countries. The assumptions, the models that the gains have been based on, just like Jayati said, have been based on assumptions of perfect competition. There's a World Bank report that came out in July that focuses purely on the Continental Trade Agreement, and it is so problematic when you look at the actual model that it has been based on, and this needs to be questioned. It needs to be questioned by those of us within the continent, and we need to have the courage to do that, and to find others as well who can essentially work around it. There's a way in which we can integrate. Nobody's saying let's not, but I think we have to seriously take a step back from this whole process and not be carried away by a notion of a Pan-African dream that has been conflated with what is essentially still fundamentally a neoliberal paradigm. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for that. Prof, can you come in? Yeah, sorry.
No, it was fun just listening. I think excellent points made there. Aren't we already running out of time? We'll try to be brief, and we can continue the conversation. I have seen that many of the participants are from UCT. Too bad I didn't come this summer. One day I'll be back, so I can see you. So the issue was, one of the questions was, how can citizens buy into the taxation strategy agenda if they don't trust the way the money is being used by the governments? They don't see the proceeds of the taxation. If there's no accountability, there is no compliance. We know about that. Incentivizing taxation is to provide services and prove that the money is being used for good cause. But I think my view in this is that the solution is not to stop paying taxes. A good citizen pays taxes. I think you should pay taxes. And then you hold the government accountable. It's find ways to organize the population, the public, so that they hold the government and the rich taxpayers, the corporations, accountable. But I mean, first think about, I think we need to, as economists, as advocates, we need to educate the public to dispel some of the misconceptions that actually arise from the way economics is taught. I mean, as Jayati indicated, one of the big principles is that if you tax more, then you kill taxes. Too much taxes kill taxes. And the famous Laffer curve, which is one of the main arguments that people use to advocate for reducing corporate tax rates, with the view that if you reduce corporate tax rates, you actually mobilize more taxes. If you increase the corporate tax rates, you kill the incentives for investment and employment. And we have seen this succeeding in the US and other places, especially in the US, where the corporate tax has gone down severely. But at the same time, if you look at what the corporations have done with that money, they have not invested. They have not created jobs. They're sitting on cash and using the cash to buy their own stocks, a process that's called stock buybacks. So basically, they are making money out of your money, because if they don't pay taxes, you pay more. You shoulder more of the tax burden. So I think this is something that needs to be understood when we teach economics, and also when for advocates, for advocacy groups, when they talk to the public, that in fact the theory about taxation needs to be revisited. One of the two points I'm going to make in terms of the way you move forward. One is transparency. We need tax to be transparent, both who is paying what taxes and what the government is doing with the revenue. I think one thing, it's almost like a mindset, in the sense that traditionally government don't feel obligated to tell the public how they are spending their money, even though the money is the public's money. It's my money. So I think one thing that has to happen is a better process of publishing government revenue and government expenditures so that the ordinary citizen can actually understand it. Also publishing the payment of the tax payments by the big corporations so that people know who is paying taxes and who is not. The other is the decentralization of control. In the US, one of the things that works well is the local control of local taxes. So for example, I pay my real estate taxes, I complain that they're high, but at least I'm happy that the quality of the schools in my area is one of the best. And the two are linked. If the town collects enough revenue, they are able to finance good schools and good programs. And that makes me feel a little bit more comfortable. If you look at globally, I would say the Northern European countries have probably some of the highest tax rates, but you don't hear them complaining about tax rates because they are very happy with the health system, the education system, the fact that their kids can go to school for free. So I think the notion that you have to bring down the tax rates to make people happy in paying taxes is completely false. You incentivize people for paying taxes by providing services and making sure that everybody who has to pay does pay taxes up to their means. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much for that. I think it's a perfect place to kind of end off the discussion today. Thank you to all of the speakers for allowing us to pick your brain. We gathered a lot of wisdom, and we really appreciate the hard work that you have done to continue the discussion and to making it more robust. So for future scholars to take on and help to improve and to rethink economics, which is what we're doing. So thank you for that. Thank you for all of the people who put in questions into the Q&A tab. Thank you for the comments and the engagement. It was really, really beneficial and helped in our discussion. I think that if you have further questions and the questions that we didn't address, please just look through the bios of the speakers. You can contact them on social media and maybe engage with them further if you'd like to do that. And I think that there's been a lot that we can take forward into our own discussions this weekend. There are huge chunks that we can unpack in our different streams. So I hope that everyone really appreciated that aspect of these discussions as well. Yeah, I think that the message of having courage and self-confidence was very clear coming from the panelists, and the urgency to reimagine the notion of value of work, employment, global taxes, and of course, power dynamics. That's what I felt came through very strongly. And that's what we're challenged to do as participants and of REFA chapters in general. So yeah, I think that I'd like to close off unless Mandile has anything to add.
I just want to thank you, Sego, for a really excellent moderation. And thanks to all the participants. Such an interesting discussion.
Cool. Thanks.
I would like to add a few more comments before we all leave. So thank you once again to the panelists, and thank you to yourself, Sego, for guiding us through that brilliant list of questions. From my side, I've got two things. I've got two extra thank yous that I'd like to give. And then I'd also just like to give some clarity on the rest of the REFA Festival. So firstly, the thank yous that I did not get to earlier were to two of the organizers that have really helped us in this REFA Festival process. So I mentioned the Rethinking Economics for Africa chapters, as well as the partners, but I'd also like to give a particular thank you to Shaira Kala and Alia Chikte, who've been the engine behind organizing this whole festival. We really appreciate your work, and we've really benefited from the hard work that you've put in. And then the final thing is on how the festival goes. So we've got a festival microsite, and I think the link has been put there. But this year's plan was to actually have interactive workshops that are happening over Friday and Saturday. So we had an application process, and that process closed. And in order to really, because the theme of this festival is action towards a pluralist economics, part of the idea is that we are hosting really focused workshops. We'll be generating ideas, generating activities for the future. So I think to everyone on this webinar, we will be in contact with you since you've given us the details by signing up. But the REFA Festival continues in these interactive workshops. But we look forward to getting in touch with you for the other activities that will happen towards the end of the year and into the new year. And so thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Cool. Great. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank
it was
you.
a real
Thank
pleasure
you.
to speak with both of you, Leonce and Jayati. I just want to say that. And
Thank
Seho,
you.
fantastic.
Thank you, Fatimah. I hope I'll see you again.
Absolutely. Me too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Take
Cheers.
care. Thank you, Bandile, as well, and everyone who participated.